Good morning. My name's Ruth. I'm one of the pastors here, and I want to give you a warm welcome this morning as we continue our short series, Three Little Words. And in this series, we are looking at some just three-word sayings of Jesus. And last week, we looked at come and see, and how Jesus invited people to come and see how he lived. The truth he brought, the light that he brought was not some abstract philosophy or even a set of teaching, but was something that he lived out, that he embodied. The word became flesh and dwelt amongst us, as we read in John chapter 1. And we heard the challenge to also be the light of the world, to be light in the darkness and sources of hope and love, so that we too can say to people, come and see. And this week we are looking at Jesus' words, abide in me. I love the word abide. I'm not really sure why. It's quite archaic. In fact, I was thinking about it. We really typically only use it in the negative form, like, I can't abide the smell of cooked cabbage or something. We can't tolerate something. We can't stand to be in the presence of something or someone, I guess. And occasionally we might use the noun form abode, as in welcome to my humble abode. But other than that, I think the word abide these days is pretty much only used in kind of a Christian religious context. With one notable exception. If you're as old as me, you might remember the Dude Abides from the Big Lebowski, a bizarre movie about bowling and a rug that really tied the room together. You might remember that one. But even that, actually, the writers said that it intentionally had religious connotations. So something about this word abide. The word abide in the Greek is menos, and it carries a sense of staying because you can and staying because you want to. There's a sense of permanence about it, of settling down and making a home or being at home in something or in someone. And the writer of John's Gospel really liked this word. They used it about 40 times in this Gospel, compared to a total of 12 times in the other three Gospels. And this morning, we're going to look at each of these 40 examples and see what... No, I'm kidding. Don't get worried. We're just going to look at a few of the examples of use of this word in the second half of the Gospel. It's interesting, or I should say, I think it's interesting that the author shifts their emphasis throughout this Gospel. The first half, the first 12 chapters are full of movement. Matthew mentioned this last week. They focus on the need to come and see, to approach Jesus, to follow Jesus, and to see not just with our eyes, but with our hearts and with our minds. Jesus is the light of the world. And following Jesus is all about entering the light, opening our minds, opening our hearts to this light that Jesus brings. Light is a big theme in the Gospel of John. In the first 12 chapters of the Gospel of John. But at the end of the 12th chapter, Jesus' public ministry ends, kind of abruptly, actually, teaching the crowds, healing the sick, performing miracles, these signs to show who he is. All of that activity comes to an end. And the author of the Gospel writes this: even after Jesus had performed so many signs in their presence, they still would not believe in him. This was to fulfill the word of Isaiah the prophet, Lord, who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For this reason they could not believe, because as Isaiah said elsewhere, he has blinded their eyes and hardened their hearts, so they can neither see with their eyes nor understand with their hearts, nor turn, and I would heal them. Isaiah said this because he saw Jesus' glory and spoke about him. Yet at the same time, many, even among the leaders, believed in him. But because of the Pharisees, they would not openly acknowledge their faith, for fear they would be put out of the synagogue, for they loved human praise more than praise from God. Then Jesus cried out, whoever believes in me does not believe in me only, but in the one who sent me. The one who looks at me is seeing the one who sent me. I have come into the world as a light, so that no one who believes in me should stay in darkness. And this is actually the last time we read about light in the Gospel of John. There are 24 mentions of light, but they're all in the first half of the Gospel. Beginning in chapter 13, we have a shift. Jesus leaves the crowds behind and he teaches the disciples exclusively. For the rest of the book, the next 9 chapters, he only interacts with the disciples and with the authorities, the ruling authorities who arrest, try, and of course execute him. It's as though at the end of chapter 12, the lines are drawn. At least for literary purposes, there are Jesus' friends and Jesus' enemies. Although, as the author alludes to in this passage, it's not really that cut and dry. There are actually others who believe who at this stage are too afraid to come forward. So in chapters 13 to 17, Jesus is with the disciples, speaking only to them, and speaking at great length. This section is sometimes referred to as the farewell discourse. It's Jesus' last words aimed at preparing the disciples for his impending death. And it's full of words of comfort and encouragement, words that we might be feeling that we really need right now. Jesus warns his disciples of what is to come, but also reassures them that they won't go through this alone. The Spirit will be with them. They won't be left as orphans. And Jesus will come to them. They will be reunited with Jesus. And in this farewell discourse, Jesus speaks a great deal about abiding. His disciples have seen, or at least have caught a glimpse of who Jesus is and what it means to walk in the light. It really is only a glimpse. They've still got a long way to go. But they've seen something of the truth, of the reality that Jesus came to reveal. They've responded to the call to come and see. And now they're told to abide, to stay, to remain, even when things get dangerous and frightening, even when it seems hopeless, even when the way of light and love seem to have failed. Even then, they need to abide in Jesus. So we're going to read a section from John chapter 15 now. And in this section, we hear Jesus' words, "Abide in me," repeated like a refrain. In fact, the word abide, menos, is used in a variety of contexts. In just 10 verses, we have Jesus saying 5 times, "Abide in me." 3 times, "I abide in you." Twice, "Abide in my love." And then once each, "I abide in the Father's love, abide in the vine, and my words abide in you." So let's read that passage now. "I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire and burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask for whatever you wish and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you." Now, this is a passage that's probably fairly familiar to many of us. We read it quite often here at Cedar Ridge. And so much of what is contained in this passage is rich and deep and mystical. But at the same time, the metaphor of a vine is pretty clear, I think, right? It's pretty easy to understand. We've probably all kept plants, maybe not grapevines, but we probably all kept plants at one time or another. I got these beautiful bonsai trees that you can see here for Christmas. They are absolutely gorgeous. And I'm very grateful for the love and the generosity of this gift. But to be honest, my heart fell just a little bit when I saw them, because I know that realistically they are on borrowed time at this point. I kill plants slowly, but I do kill them. I get busy, I get distracted. Unlike pets and kids, plants don't say anything if they don't get watered or fed or light or whatever. So generally those under my care have a habit of dying, unfortunately. And you may be thinking, wait a minute, doesn't she run the farm? Yes, I do. The good thing about the farm is that none of the plants need to last for more than a few months. And I have other people that I can rely on to help them make them last that long. The only exceptions on the farm are the strawberries and the grapevines. Last year I did a terrible job of keeping the strawberries alive, and so I'm pretty sure they are all dead at this point. But the grapevines, here they are. They look dead, but they're not. Despite total neglect, they will put out leaves in late spring, and by summer they will cover that frame there and provide a nice shaded spot on an otherwise very hot farm. And they do that every year. And of course they do that because they are connected to the vine, a vine with deep roots that feeds them and empowers them to produce leaves and fruit. So we get the analogy, right? We understand that if you cut off a branch, it can't bear fruit. No matter how hard it tries, it needs to remain connected to the vine or be grafted back onto a vine pretty quickly to stay alive and be fruitful. I think we also appreciate the need for pruning, right? It's a form of care. Some of us may have rose bushes that we know we need to prune. You've got to cut them back to keep them beautiful and productive. We have not done any pruning of our vines at all on the farm, the grapevines, and it really shows. They still grow fruit because they're connected to the vine, but the grapes are pretty small and not particularly flavorful because we don't prune it, we don't feed it, we don't care for it in any way. So this metaphor, I think, is quite straightforward. But what does it mean for us here today in 2025? How might God use this passage to speak to us today? How does it impact how we live our lives? If we, like the disciples, have somehow caught a glimpse of the light of Christ, if we're trying to follow Jesus, what does it mean to abide in him, especially in difficult times, in scary times? The author of John's Gospel has framed these words as part of Jesus' final speech to his disciples. So clearly, he thought that they were hugely important. Knowing that he was soon going to die, Jesus said repeatedly, "Abide in me." Well, there are a few things that occurred to me as I was thinking about this passage. And firstly, I think it's interesting that Jesus begins this discourse by saying, "I am the true vine." This kind of suggests that there are potentially other vines out there. There are other things, other people that we can connect ourselves to and draw from, feed from. And it's easy, I think, to think of some external influences. We know external influences can be very significant. As Paul, one of the leaders of the early church, wrote in his first letter to the church in Corinth, "Do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good character." Paul is there quoting and endorsing something written by the ancient Greek poet Menander. And we know this from experience. So we know that there are people who inspire us to be better people. And there are others who bring out the worst in us. People and environments impact us. The media we consume impacts us. The things we spend our time on, the company we keep, these things influence the kind of people we become. But I think equally important, and maybe perhaps more important than that kind of passive feeding, absorbing from our external environment, is what we actually feed on internally. Where does our mind dwell? Where does it abide? Do we fixate on our fears and anxieties and allow worst-case scenarios to play out in our heads? Do we linger on our hurts and on our disappointments? Do we allow negative feelings and experiences to run through our minds on an endless loop? Do we feed them? Do we nurture them until they produce fruit? Fruit like bitterness and anger and cynicism. Now, I'm not saying for one moment that we should repress negative feelings and experiences and pretend everything's fine. That would be very unhealthy. There's a lot to be learned, a lot of healing that can happen through processing things and talking about them. But that healthy processing is very different from something that we probably all do at some times. I know I definitely do, which is simply to feed our fears and to feed our hurts, to sink into them and to abide in them. Paul writes this in his letter to the Philippians. "Don't worry about everything, but in everything, through prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. That might sound pretty unrealistic, right? Don't worry about anything? Really? Does Paul know what we're up against? It would be tempting to dismiss this if it weren't for the fact that Paul was a prisoner at the time he wrote this and not expecting actually to get out of that experience alive. And he wasn't a Pollyanna kind of upbeat kind of person. Many scholars studying his writings think that he struggled with depression. There's a lot of self-doubt, there's a lot of anxiety that seeps through his writing. And yet sitting in his prison cell, wondering if he was going to be executed, he writes those incredible words. And he continues, "Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any moral excellence, and if there is anything praiseworthy, dwell on these things." I think we know empirically actually from studies that focusing on good, positive, lovely things can make us healthier and happier people. Studies show that intentionally looking for good things through the day, things that we're grateful for, things that bring us joy, that changes our perspective. It gets us focusing on the things that give us, make us happy and hopeful, and so we feel those things. We feel hopeful, we feel happy. And yet sometimes I know that I prefer the perverse pleasure of nursing my wounds and viewing myself as a victim. I know I play out nightmare scenarios in some kind of a bizarre belief that if I've thought it through, then I'll be prepared, or it won't happen, or it won't hurt so much. I'll be ready. And I seriously doubt I'm the only person who does this. So first then, I think it's useful to ask ourselves the question, what does my mind dwell on? Where does it abide? What am I feeding it? Second, Jesus says, "Abide in me as I abide in you." Now, we've probably read that many times, and perhaps it doesn't really impact us anymore, but I was thinking about that, and just what a beautiful promise, what a reassurance there is in that statement. I abide in you. We are instructed to abide in Jesus. It seems we've got a choice there as to whether we want to abide in Jesus or not. But Jesus also says that he abides in us. How wonderfully reassuring that is. Just a few verses before this passage on the vine and the branches, Jesus says this, "I will not leave you orphaned. I am coming to you. In a little while the world will no longer see me, but you will see me. Because I live, you also will live. On that day you will know that I am in you. You will know that I am in my Father, and you in me, and I in you." We are in Jesus. Jesus is in us, and Jesus is in the Father. Catholic theologian Catherine Cunha put it this way, "Jesus is who and what God is. He is who and what we are to become. Jesus owes his whole existence, authority, identity, and purpose to God. He originates from God, is begotten of God, belongs eternally to the life and existence of God. Through him, we too originate from God, are begotten of God, and belong eternally to the life and existence of God." What an incredible thought, that we belong eternally to the life and existence of God. If we can live in that reality, then surely Paul's words are true, that the peace of God that passes all understanding will guard our hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. If we can live in the light of knowing that we belong eternally to the life and existence of God, we can let go, or at least begin to start to let go of anxiety and of striving and of needing to prove ourselves, of needing to feel significant. How much more significant can you get than being in Jesus and Jesus being in us? So perhaps another useful question is, how and why am I striving? Indeed, the analogy of fruit growing on a vine suggests an absence of striving. Fruit grows naturally, silently, gradually. It's something that's produced organically as a result of a vine being alive and healthy. And we are promised fruitfulness if we abide in Jesus. But that if is important. Jesus doesn't present this as a passive relationship. Rather, Jesus suggests that although we are already in him and he is in us, this vital connection can maybe be broken or at least experienced as being broken. The movement that characterized the first half of John's gospel has stopped. Chapter 13 begins this time when Jesus is in an intimate setting in the upper room with his closest friends for several chapters. And the emphasis has shifted to abiding. Nevertheless, the concept of following Jesus continues throughout the whole gospel. In fact, the gospel ends with Jesus telling Peter to follow me. Abiding and following are not at odds with each other. Abiding isn't idleness and passivity. Abiding in Jesus means following Jesus, being yoked to Jesus, as we read in Matthew's gospel in those very famous words that we often read, and we're going to read again. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. A yoke, of course, is for working. It's the thing that went around an animal's neck to connect it to a cart or a plow or to whatever else. And typically in first century Palestine, the symbol of a yoke was a symbol of servitude, of heavy labor, of forced labor. But Jesus says his yoke is easy, his burden is light. The phrase, take my yoke and learn from me, it brings to mind the practice of teaching an animal how to plow. They used to yoke an animal to an older animal that knew how to plow, and when it first started to learn how, this is how they would plow. They would put a plow around two animals, and the older one, the one that knows how to plow, would really do much of the work. The younger one wasn't really carrying much of the weight, wasn't doing a lot of the force, but was learning to walk in step, was learning how to do this. Abiding in Jesus is not passive. It's walking and working, but nor is it heavy and stressful. Jesus takes the weight from our shoulders. The picture is not one of running to catch up to Jesus, but of walking in step with him, learning to walk in step with him. This is how fruit is produced. Fruitfulness is promised, and a lack of fruit is a sign that something is wrong. Specifically, according to this passage, it's the result of a failure to love. Jesus says, as the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. If we live in the light of the reality that we are in Jesus and Jesus is in us, then we will understand that we are all one. If we abide in Jesus' love, if we feed on that love, if we absorb that love and make our homes in that love, then we will naturally, organically love others. If we don't love them, we're denying our oneness. We're separating ourselves from the vine, and then we will wither. We will become dry and brittle. So another question we might want to ponder is, do I really love others? We are commanded to love as Jesus loved. That's a very tall order, isn't it? To love as Jesus loved, to love self-sacrificially, to put the needs of others before our own, to step aside and allow others to be seen and heard, to serve others, to stand with them in the fight for justice and equity, to love the people we find difficult, to love people who've let us down, to love our enemies, to love when we're tired or scared or hurting. But we read the same command in 1 John, the same connection between loving and being in God. We read, dear friends, since God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us, and God's love is made complete in us. God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God, and God in them. We love because God first loved us. Whoever claims to love God yet hates a brother or sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. And he has given us this command: anyone who loves God must also love their brother and sister. We know this, right? We hear it over and over. Love God, love neighbor. It's pretty simple, except doing it is not so simple, right? It's great in theory. Let's just love everybody. But in practice, it can be really hard. When I'm reading scripture, when I'm with good friends, when I'm praying, when I'm out in nature, when life feels good, I am all for loving people. It's a totally great idea, and I really want to get on board with that. But when I'm interacting with certain individuals at home, at work, out in the neighborhood, in the supermarket, when I'm watching the news, when I'm interacting on social media, when I'm driving, all different kinds of scenarios, that's when it really starts to get harder, right? It's so easy to other people to think that branch over there, well, that's not part of me. But when we separate ourselves from others, when we choose hate or disdain over love, we actually separate ourselves from the vine. Not to be flippant, but it's rather like the classic tree cutting fail, severing the limb that you're sitting on. I really hope that's a staged photo, because that would be kind of sad. But love then is both a choice and a fruit. We are commanded to love one another, so we must be able to do it, something that we have some level of control over. But at the same time, Jesus says in verse 5, apart from me, you can do nothing. It's by staying connected to Jesus, staying yoked to him, that we are able to love others as he has loved us. But if those who abide in Jesus bear much fruit, as it says here in verse 5, what are we to make of verse 2, where Jesus talks about those branches in him that don't bear fruit? Jesus said, if we look at those verses again, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word that I have spoken to you. And then he goes on a little later to say, whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. Well, to understand what these verses mean, we need to know a tiny bit of Greek and a little bit about the agricultural practices of the day. So first the Greek, obviously the language that this was first written in. Let's put those first 3 verses back up. Okay, so there are 2 important words here. The word translated removes literally means lifts up. It's often used to mean lift something up to take it away, but it can also just mean simply lifts up. And in at least 8 of the 24 times that we find this word in the Gospel of John, it is translated lifts or lifts up. So this either reads, the Father removes every branch that bears no fruit, or it reads, the Father lifts up every branch that bears no fruit. The second important word is the one that is here translated prunes. This is an agricultural technical term for pruning a plant, but it can also mean cleans. Cleans. So when Jesus says that the branches are pruned and the disciples have been cleansed, he is using the same word twice. It could have been translated, you have already been pruned by the word that I have spoken to you. So now a little bit about the agricultural practices of the day. And this is important because it's easy to make faulty assumptions when it comes to pruning. Again, I learned that the hard way. We used to grow strawberries, we did, but that's another story. We used to grow raspberries also on the farm, and they got kind of out of hand, so we decided to prune them at the end of the season. And perhaps like it seems to be saying in these verses, we decided to cut out all of the ones that hadn't borne any fruit. Now the problem was, unbeknownst to us, we were growing summer-bearing raspberries, and their canes last 2 years, and the canes don't produce fruit in the first year. And if you cut them, they won't grow in the second year either. So, not good. So pruning is tricky, right? You've got to really know what you're dealing with because it varies so much from one type of plant to another. So let's not make assumptions about pruning till we know something about it. Gary Derrickson conducted an in-depth study of vine growing techniques in the 1st century, looking at various ancient documents. There are actually writings all about how to grow vines and produce wine. And there are lots of contracts with laborers, which prove to be very informative. And in his analysis of this passage from John 15, he writes this: most commentators state that farmers removed unfruitful branches and then cleaned up the fruiting branches to make them more fruitful. But this is not accurate. He then goes on to describe at some length the different viticultural practices that are documented, and he shows that grapevines had generally been grown along the ground, but the Romans introduced trellises. Now, trellises are great because they lift up the branches, providing them with much better air circulation. That dries off the dew, which is very important to the health of the plant. And it also protects the branches and the fruit from the various pests and damage that happen by being on the ground. He also states that there were two different seasons for pruning. So after the harvest, vine growers would go and strip off all the leaves to force the vines into dormancy. And they would cut off any dead or diseased wood, and they would gather them up and burn them. And they'd also cut back all the branches in general. And then in the spring, they would remove excess shoots from the fruiting branches, and they would tie up some of the healthy but non-fruiting branches onto the trellis. And those non-fruiting branches, they would leave all the shoots on. They wouldn't remove anything from it. They would let it produce as many leaves as it could, because that would make the actual branch thicker and more sturdy for bearing fruit the following year. Jesus' conversation with the disciples in John 15 takes place at the time of the Passover, so we know it was the spring. And Judas, the betrayer, has already left the group. He's gone off to betray Jesus, and now Jesus is just with the 11. He's comforting his closest friends. He's reassuring that he will always be with them. He won't leave them. They don't need to be afraid. He's with them. He's in them. They are in him. So it seems unlikely that he's also telling them, if you don't provide fruit, you're going to be cut off and thrown into a fire, right? That would be odd in this context. In fact, he said that they're already cleansed, they're already pruned, and we're ready to bear fruit. We read that in verse 3, if we want to put that back up. But there are other branches, it seems, that are not yet bearing fruit. What will happen to them? What will happen to the people who we were told believed in Jesus but were afraid to come forward because they knew that they would be put out of the synagogues? Well, in first century vineyards, healthy, non-fruit-bearing branches were cared for because they were needed for fruit production in subsequent years. They weren't cut off, and certainly they weren't cut off in the spring. They were lifted up onto the trellis so that they could grow strong enough to bear fruit the following year. But as we see in verse 6, after the harvest, dead branches that weren't connected to the vine and had withered away, were gathered up and burned. The branches weren't being punished. The burning of dried materials was part of the end of the season activities, part of caring for a vineyard. Now, obviously, this is an analogy, and all analogies break down at some point, and so it's always hard to know how far should you take an analogy. But what we can clearly see here is that Jesus is promising his followers that if they abide in him, they will bear fruit. They don't need to be anxious, they don't need to be striving, they will bear fruit. And even in seasons when they're not fruitful, or it seems they're not fruitful, it seems that God will still care for them, will provide for them what they need to reach a place of fruitfulness. So as I look on my own life and ask, am I bearing fruit? I don't need to feel condemned. As long as we keep abiding in Jesus, fruit will come. We're all on a journey, a hopeful journey. We can trust in God's care and God's provision if we keep abiding, keep following, keep walking in step with Jesus, even when we don't see fruit. At the same time, fruitful or not, we know that pruning needs to happen. Dead wood needs removing. Diseased branches will kill a plant. They need to go. Excess growth needs cutting back. So the obvious next question is perhaps, is there anything that needs pruning in me? Are there thought patterns, are there practices in my life that I know are hindering my ability to stay in step with Jesus? Are there things that I know are wounding me or wounding others? Do I no longer make time for or have time for cultivating that connection with God? Whatever that might look like for me. Whether that's contemplative practices or scripture or being out in nature or music or art or whatever it is. Am I making time to grow in my experience of God's presence? And then finally, something I've been pondering is, do I know just how loved I am? And I would say the answer to that, not just for me, but for all of us, is no. Paul, in his letter to the church in Ephesus, wrote this: I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power together with all the Lord's holy people to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. The love of Christ surpasses knowledge. It's something that we can only experience. Jesus said, as the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. How incredible is that? As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. The immeasurable depth and extent of the Father's love for Jesus, that's the same love Jesus has for us. And knowing that love, experiencing that love, abiding in that love, as well as pouring that love out to others, brings joy. That was the joy that Jesus knew, and the joy that Jesus wants for us too. Jesus instructed us to let his words abide in us, dwell in us, take up residence in us. So we're going to allow these words to do that this morning. So I'm going to ask you maybe just to close your eyes, and we'll put the lights down a bit. We can just put up that last slide. Jesus' words: as the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Let's just still our hearts and allow our minds to ponder these words, to allow them to get down deep into us, for us to absorb them and for them to really dwell in us. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Despite our failures, our brokenness, our insecurities, Jesus says, as the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Whatever our current circumstances, whether we feel fruitful or fruitless, whether we feel cared for or not, Jesus says, as the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. No matter how daunting the future looks, how anxious we might feel, Jesus says, as the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. Amen. I'm going to take communion now, if the band would like to come back up. As we mentioned earlier, Jesus gave this farewell discourse to his disciples in the upper room on the night that he was betrayed and was arrested. And shortly before saying these things, Jesus shared a meal with his friends. And during that meal, according to John's Gospel, he washed his disciples' feet to demonstrate what love looks like, what it looks like in practice. Servant-hearted, humble. He washed the feet of all of them, including Judas, who had plotted to betray him. Jesus demonstrated inclusive, self-sacrificial, unconditional love. In the other gospel accounts, we read of how he took bread and broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "My body broken for you." And in the same way, took the cup and said, "This is my blood shed for you." And as we eat and drink in this symbolic way, we symbolize our desire for the body and blood, the very life of Jesus to dwell in us, to become part of who we are as we become more like Jesus. Everyone is welcome to take communion here this morning, with no exceptions. You are all very, very welcome. Come and join with us as we are all one and we celebrate that we are one in Jesus. You can come and take communion from one of the tables at the front or at the middle. You can take that back to your chair if you'd like to, or you can stand around the table and take it with others, whichever feels more comfortable to you. There are other ways to respond. Those are listed out on the first page of the flyer you should have got when you came in. But we can just use this time to respond as we feel appropriate, as the band leads us in singing.